The IRS recommended multiple felony charges against Hunter Biden for tax years 2014 through 2019, relating to at least $8.3 million in income from foreign companies.
And that was Jason Smith. He's chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Berkowitz and I are going to be talking about an explosive story that if you've been following any of the news, well, I should say any of the news on Fox News, because the main networks have been ignoring it, but an explosive story with very credible allegations made by members of the Congress, members of the IRS, about allegations of payoffs being made by foreign countries to the Bidens, to Hunter Biden, to Joe Biden, and other members of the Biden family. And now that the Republicans are controlling the House for the last 7 months, they've started an investigation. We're starting to hear things, Jeff, that we never heard before when Nancy Pelosi was controlling this. But now the information is coming out, and we've had whistleblowers coming forward from both whistleblowers from the FBI and more recently 2 whistleblowers from the IRS testifying that there have been a lot of shenanigans going on and that investigations have been hamstrung, to use a term used by one of the IRS agents.
Well, we're beginning to see the United States government beginning to operate as it was intended in modern times. 2 parties, not one. Democratic Party, Republican Party. Divided government. Republicans controlled in the House, Democrats controlling the Senate, Democrats controlling the presidency. The Supreme Court leaning to the right. So the judiciary, at least the Supreme Court, is more Republican, if you want to put it that way, than Democrat. Divided government, some clash of ideas, some discussion, some. How will this affect? Let's keep an eye on the big prize, the 2024 election. How will this affect the presidential GOP primary? Will there be a real Democratic primary between J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, the governor, and Governor Newsom from California? Will that be the real, will Biden have to step down because of all the things you've raised and his lack of mental acuity? Could this all happen in the next 18 months? Could America change from where it is now? That's the big picture, Terry.
Well, and the story is, I think the big picture is, will Joe Biden even make it to Election Day? Because now we have Kevin McCarthy for the first time, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, saying that they may have to launch impeachment hearings against Joe Biden. I would say that is early on. That could change. And I'm not sure even a lot of Republicans in the House necessarily want to impeach Joe Biden as much as they would like to have someone else in the White House. They don't want to put Kamala Harris, who has demonstrated her incompetency as vice president. So the last person they want to have pushed into the Oval Office, I think, is Kamala Harris. So that's one thing that Joe Biden has going for him. What he has going against him is this drip, 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 and evidence coming forward. This is not speculation. This is evidence coming forward, provided by government sources, provided by bank records, that money has been transferred to the Bidens. And the other thing I would say, there's an indictment of credibility by the mainstream media when the 3 major networks are not covering this story, and it's Fox News and the Washington, or I should say the New York Post, who has been breaking this story. Jeff, you and I are old enough to remember Watergate, and at first, none of the media was actually covering the Watergate story. It was only the Washington Post that was out there with Woodward and Bernstein for about the first 5 or 6 months. And we kind of see that in the movie All the President's Men, that Woodward and Bernstein were out there, and the people, the executives at the Washington Post were saying, where are the other people? Why aren't they covering this story? We kind of have that same thing going on now. The New York Times is not doing it. The Washington Post is not doing it. So the New York Post is doing it, as well as Fox News. Well, let's focus on what the government is saying, what IRS agents are saying, what has been determined, because remember, the other media isn't covering the story. A lot of people don't know these details.
We'll go through that, Terry. I'm not opposed to that. Well, you started that. And the difficulty here, Terry, is in projecting. We're trying to inform our viewers. The question is, how much of what you've talked about for the last 5 minutes will actually reach the public, the large part, not just the 50% or so
Let's move.
of
Come on.
Republicans
Let's move.
who will like it, but also the moderates, the independents, so they can maybe change some minds.
Okay. I don't want to be
Because-
talking right now about politics. I want to be talking about the investigation. Okay. We can move from investigation to the impact on the 24 election. The 24 election is still a long way off. Let's focus on what's being said last week, what's going to be said next week. This is an investigation
what he said-
into the President of the United States and his family taking millions of dollars, number one. Number two, it's increasingly clear that there are allegations, credible allegations being made about a cover-up. And the cover-up could be even worse for the Bidens than what we are seeing from the investigation about them taking millions of dollars and not paying taxes on it.
Well,
Here is, let me run this clip here of IRS agent Ziegler, who testified last week, so that our viewers can follow what's being said, because chances are very good they may not have heard anything about this.
In early August of 2022, the assigned prosecutors, all four attorneys, agreed to recommend felony and misdemeanor charges for the 2017, 18, and 19 tax years. It appeared to me, based on what I experienced, that the U.S. Attorney in Delaware in our investigation was constantly hamstrung, limited, and marginalized by DOJ officials as well as other U.S. attorneys. I still think that a special counsel is necessary for this investigation.
So Mr. Ziegler is saying, for obvious reasons, that he still thinks there should be a special prosecutor put in here. And we have the investigation that's been going on. David Weiss is a prosecutor, federal prosecutor. And as Mr. Ziegler was saying, they've been hamstrung in a variety of ways. I'm not going to get into all the details. They did go into those details about these investigations being hamstrung by the Department of Justice.
One point is that Ziegler has a lot of credibility. He's not a Republican with an axe to grind. He came out and testified and said it clearly. Look, I'm a Democrat. I'm a gay American. I've been accused of being a traitor by many people I associate with, because as a Democrat, they think he shouldn't be saying these things. So that gives him a lot of credibility on what he said. That's number one. Two, there are two people testifying from the IRS, two whistleblowers. So that gives, and they're very, very consistent. So that gives them more credibility. And then now there's more coming out. As we're taping this on July 25, we're talking about a hearing projected on a committee hearing, and we're here talking about the appearance on July 31 at that hearing of Devin Archer, who's a longtime associate of Hunter Biden. And it's expected that he's going to provide a lot of testimony about the involvement of Joe Biden in these discussions, where suddenly Hunter Biden will be meeting with some business people and people he's trying to get money from. And suddenly he just calls up Joe Biden and puts him on the speakerphone. Sometimes apparently tells Joe that, sometimes not. And the Biden administration, a lot through KJP, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, has previously been saying, as has Joe Biden said, I've never spoken to my son about his business. In the last few days, though, Karine Jean-Pierre has changed it to say, oh, I've been asked this many times. As you know what I've said and what the president said, it has always been the president was never in business with his son.
Yeah, so the White House is
change.
changing their tune. When asked directly a number of times, both during the campaign and I think subsequent to being in the White House, Joe Biden has consistently said, I never talked to my son about his business. I didn't even know he was on the Burisma board, he said, the Ukrainian oil and gas. However, Miranda Devine, the reporter who's been breaking so many of these stories with the New York Post, as she said here 2 days ago, this is the headline, Hunter Biden put then Vice President Joe Biden on the phone with business associates at least 24 times, according to Devin Archer, who was both Hunter Biden's business partner as well, it is said, his best friend. And now he is going to be testifying. He's scheduled to testify on Monday before the House Oversight Committee. And if he does come through, just as we saw from the IRS agents, now this is another very credible person because we know that Devin Archer was very close to Hunter Biden and a business partner of his. So we are getting credible testimony on these allegations.
Well, we'll see how credible, because as you know, Terry, the Democrats will try to paint him as a guy who's in trouble, who's being charged with many violations, federal law in the United States, and wants to say things and do things to maybe lessen his prior future sentence if he is convicted, as seems likely. So that diminishes somewhat his credibility. He's not quite the choir boy, Boy Scout that Mr. Ziegler was from the IRS. We'll see how it goes. He may be credible, may not. You can't really tell until we see how it looks and how people react.
As you know, you have a law degree. How often is it the prosecution uses someone else who is involved in a crime to testify against others? How often does that happen?
Often you can't go out and get choir boys and get the testimony.
Right. So the
you
fact
need.
that Devin Archer has a very checkered past, which no one would question, it's not unusual to have someone who is involved in a conspiracy be flipped and become the star witness against the conspiracy so that they can get the inside story. And that is what I think Devin Archer is. And again, this allegation is that the Bidens were going out, and this started when when Joe Biden was in the vice presidency, started under the Obama administration, that they were going out and shaking down foreign governments for money. One of the people that wrote a book, which I have, I don't know if you'll be able to see, it's by Peter Schweitzer, a best-selling book, came out about 18 months ago, called Red-Handed. It wasn't just about the Bidens, it was about people in Washington, big, powerful people taking a lot of money from different sources, including the Chinese. So what was it's often asked, what was the business of the Bidens? Here they set up something like 15, 20 different LLCs, I forget the exact number, that they were moving money through. What was the business of the Bidens? What were they selling? Here's what Peter Schweitzer said yesterday as we taped this on July 25 on the Jesse Waters Fox show.
What is the Biden's business? They're getting all this money from overseas. They're getting all this money for artwork that frankly is not worth $500,000. What is the business? What's the product? The product is Joe Biden.
So what he was saying is that Joe Biden is the product, that it was influence peddling, according to what Peter Schweitzer is alluding to.
It's if the Republicans can make a credible argument along the lines you just suggested, it will be very, very important, because Joe Biden, these are allegations that in large part relate to Joe Biden when he was vice president of the United States and a part of the important part, obviously, of the Obama-Biden administration. And if he was receiving these funds then, in some sense, from the Chinese companies, which, as we know, in China, the company is often a part of the Chinese Communist Party. It's really like getting it from China. And if he's in a position where he's compromised now, and if he's compromised or viewed as compromised, that, along with his lack of mental acuity, will probably cause him to have to withdraw. I know you don't want to get into politics right now, but we should say these things are always.
I don't want to get into Trump right now, but I think the point you make is a point that I've made. If people watch this show, know I've said repeatedly, I don't think Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee, and we hear that now more and more people around the country, news people, political commentators are saying the same thing. Joe Biden has clearly lost mentally his mental acuity. You look at the clips from when he was vice president or even when he was a candidate back in 2020, he is a hollowed out man now. And so to say that he would be reelected next year and then spend another 4 years, it's very difficult to picture him having the mental aptitude to do the job. So that's number one. And then now on top of that, with all of these very credible allegations of of corruption, criminal corruption, I think at the very least, if he's not removed from office via impeachment, that I think the Democratic Party will remove him. And that's something I have always thought. My periscope is that Biden will not be the nominee. Frankly, my guess would be that the Republicans, even if they were to impeach him, I don't think Biden would be removed from office. I think there's a very good argument that you could make to remove him. As I have said before, Jeff, you and I remember Vice President Spiro Agnew being forced out of his office back in October of 1973. It'll be 50 years ago this October. And why? Because he took bribes from highway contractors while he was the governor of Maryland. Well, here we are, the allegations that Biden took bribes while he was vice president. So these are credible allegations, but anyway, we'll have to see what happens.
Well, more likely what will happen is Biden will serve out his term, this current term, to the election of 2024, and he will be hobbled. And more to the point, the Democratic Party nationally will be hobbled. And this administration will not be able to do much in the way of foreign policy, conduct of foreign policy, conduct of domestic policy, and that will impinge on the Democratic nominee, or who will be the Democratic nominee for president in the 2024 election. As we've said before, it's likely to be J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, and Newsom, governor of California, running in primaries against each other, and one of those likely to be the Democratic nominee for president.
Yeah, we have Bobby Kennedy. I think many in the Democratic establishment would not let Bobby Kennedy become the nominee. Right. Two wild cards. One is Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, who increasingly looks like he cannot be reelected in what is increasingly now a red state in West Virginia. And so there's some discussion about whether Joe Manchin would run as a third-party candidate. A lot of Republicans like Joe Manchin because he's not a far-left Democrat. So that's something.
And yet it's viewed that Manchin would take more votes from Democrats than he would from Republicans. So Manchin's a major threat to the Democratic Party if he does run as a third-party candidate. And as we turn to look at the Republican Party and what's going on there in their presidential primaries, we see some recent polls in Iowa, South Carolina, and New Hampshire that all
the early primary states, basically. Yeah,
the early primary states. That similar to the national polls, these state polls showed a wide lead for President Trump, former President Trump, over Ron DeSantis, or whoever happens to be second. In South Carolina, it's Trump at 48%, and Nikki Haley actually at 14%, Ron DeSantis at 13%, and Tim Scott at 10%. So we haven't seen that before, that kind of grouping. If you add those up, you see they've got 37%, Pence 4%, it's 41. So the counters to Trump have 41% to his 48. The real question is, can at some point the Republicans coalesce around one of those four candidates? More likely it would be Ron DeSantis or Scott or Haley. If they can, then you could have a real battle for the Republican nomination between Trump and one of those. Will that happen? Will it happen in Iowa? Because if it doesn't happen in Iowa, it probably is not going to happen.
My guess is it does not happen because we're going to have, when is Super Tuesday going to be coming up in March?
March, right?
So it's so early on that you pick up a significant number of delegates that I mean, my read is that anything could happen, but I think Trump will pick up enough Republican delegates
Well,
early
we'll
on. It
see.
would be
So
hard for
far, these
others.
indictments that have happened, the indictment on the national security documents has only helped Trump in the primary. The question is, if he's indicted, as seems likely now, by Jack Smith, um, will that, and the January 6th thing, will that start compounding his problems? He has a trial date set for May 4, which is more toward the end of the scheduled likely end of the Republican primaries. There's a trial date set for May 4 on the classified documents. Will these things start to make him a less attractive candidate in the Republican Party simply because the argument will be made that even if he's popular among Republicans, he needs to win over independents, he needs to win over moderate Democrats to win in the general election? Will the argument be made that one of these other candidates will have similar policies to Trump, which Republicans like, but less baggage? We'll see. We'll see.
My argument would be no. I don't think the
that.
Republican voters, I don't think the majority of the Republican voters put much stock in these investigations. They look at them as phony baloney, more political influence, as we were just talking about the political influence in these investigations where the DOJ is blocking investigations into Biden. The Republican voters are reading these different prosecutions of Trump as being politically motivated, and they're not putting much stock into them. So I think the larger question is, if you say, is this going to damage Trump? It would have to be, does it damage him in the minds of non-Republican voters and people that might otherwise, the independents come his way? That's possible. It's hard to say.
Well, and yeah, the point is, you're likely right as to what they think about what the Republicans think about these indictments. The concern they may have, well, what do independents think? What do moderate Democrats think? Is he going to be able to win the general election? Because he has to win 95% of the Republicans, which could be a challenge, but then he's got to win a large share of independents and Democrats. And what we'll hopefully start talking about soon, Terry, is what are the likely issues in the general election as well as in the primaries. Immigration, inflation, the economy, foreign policy, the impact of China as a military and economic power. These are all things we should be talking about for the benefit
I think certainly
of the
the
country.
economy. I would agree with you on all those issues. All of those issues are, but we've seen from polling that the economy is, I think, the number one issue on the minds of people. And I think part and parcel of that is not only Biden's attack on fossil fuels, but I would say the Democratic Party's attack on fossil fuels. So you got a lot of people who think, well, we got to get rid of fossil fuels or we're destroying the planet. But we also see when you go after oil, you drive up the price of things because everything has a price component of oil built into it because of transportation. Things don't come to your house miraculously. And so if you're going to attack fossil fuels, then you're going to have to say, you got to be willing, public, to be paying higher prices. That's number one. And we know from now the Chinese are building like 1 to 2 new coal-fired power plants a week for their building out their electric grid. So if we're going to be attacking fossil fuels, how many on the left are willing to go after China? So as you say, China is a military threat, but also China, if you want to make a global warming issue or a climate crisis issue, then you got to be willing to go after China because they are heavily dependent on the use of fossil fuels.
Well, and as we go again toward the general election, we haven't mentioned the Ukraine war and Biden's or the Democrats' handling of that war. And certainly that'll be an issue, and that'll tie in with the energy issue you've just raised now, because obviously Russia had a lot more leverage over the Europeans, which how much they supported or didn't support the American efforts, which primarily have been American efforts, but with some significant support and to support Ukraine. Oh, as a big part of that was what were the energy issues of Europe at that time? How closely wedded were they to Russia for natural gas as well as oil? And also, how did China interplay with that? So, if the United States has a stronger energy industry, is more an exporter than an importer, that will affect foreign policy events. And the Democrats, I think, are quite weak on that for the reason, partly for the reasons you just pointed out. The more they push on climate change, the more China does not participate in that, the more they expect the United States to modify its economy and do a lot of climate change restraints that impair the U.S. economy, but doesn't impair the Chinese economy.
Here's the other thing, and the Democrats are screwing up politically on this. The Biden administration, at least, is screwing up, and it's going to hurt Democrats. And I don't think Joe Biden's going to be the nominee. I would say it's probably Governor Newsom. But what we have seen and what the voters see is they're not just talking about oil. They're not just talking about coal, both of which are going to drive up your home utility prices and food prices and the rest. But they're going after your gas stoves, which a lot of people hold near and dear. They're going after, now this week, water heaters. Oh, we can't have gas-powered water heaters anymore. They say it's going to save $1,000 over so many years.
They're also going after, Democrats are also going after nuclear and natural gas. So where does their energy grid come from if they eliminate nuclear and natural gas? And when we talk about somebody replacing
it will literally leave you out in the cold.
Well, yes, literally. And as you point out, likely that Pritzker or Newsom replaces Biden as the nominee. Where's Pritzker been for the last few weeks? He's been over in London sort of championing the idea of Illinois as a major climate change state. So is he going to keep running on that? Is he going to run that somehow we're going to do more?
Well, he probably would until
that's the trajectory he's on now, right?
If he actually jumps in the race, either as a presidential candidate or if he were to be picked as a vice presidential candidate, I would say at least J.B. Pritzker has shown himself to be a credible administrator. Doesn't mean I support all of his policies, but he's a credible person, unlike, I would say, our current vice president. So if you had a Newsom-Pritzker ticket, you have an attractive candidate as Governor Newsom. You have a lot of money with the Pritzkers, not just JB, but others. So the Democrats would be far more in a better position to hold on to the White House than they would if they go down the route with Joe Biden.
Just know this. We haven't mentioned crime.
Let's not go there now because we only have about a minute, and you and I are always saying things at the last second. I want to say, folks, in the last minute, tell us what you think. If you're watching this on YouTube, tell Jeff and I what you think about some of these issues, whether you want Joe Biden to be the nominee or not. And if you like what we're doing here, give us a like on YouTube and also share it with your friends if you would. Repost it on some of the other social medias.